June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa kicks off. Germany unleashes the largest invasion force in human history across the Soviet border. Panzer divisions roll east with swagger. They've already steamrolled Poland, France, the Low Countries. Tank crews think they've seen it all. They have the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, battle-tested machines that crushed everything in their path across Europe. They're confident, maybe too confident. Then they meet the KV-1. Imagine you're a German tanker. You're rolling through Lithuania, maybe a few days into the invasion. Things are going well. Soviet resistance is disorganized. You're making good progress. Then your column spots a Soviet tank on the horizon. It's big, really big. Your commander orders you to engage. You fire. The shell hits dead center, but instead of the satisfying crunch of penetration, you hear a metallic ping. The shell bounces off. You fire again. Same result. Again. Nothing. And now this monster is turning its turret toward you. Welcome to the nightmare that was fighting the KV-1 in 1941. To understand why the KV-1 was such a shock, you need to know what Germany brought to the party. The Wehrmacht's primary battle tanks in 1941 were the Panzer III and Panzer IV. These weren't bad machines. The Panzer III was designed as the main battle tank, armed with a 37mm gun initially, upgraded to a 50mm by 1940. It had decent mobility, okay armor, around 30mm on the front. The Panzer IV was meant for infantry support, packing a short-barreled 75mm gun designed to fire high explosive rounds at bunkers and trenches, not to penetrate heavy armor. German tank doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and combined arms. They didn't build heavy breakthrough tanks like the French Char B1 or the British Matilda. Those were seen as slow, expensive, and unnecessary. The Blitzkrieg concept was all about mobility, outmaneuvering the enemy, hitting weak points, encircling, destroying command and control. It worked brilliantly against France. Why change a winning formula? But here's the thing. The Germans made assumptions. They assumed Soviet tanks would be similar to what they'd faced before, maybe a bit crude, probably poorly organized, definitely beatable. German intelligence had some reports about new Soviet heavy tanks, but the scale and capability were underestimated, massively underestimated. The KV-1, named after Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, entered service in 1939. It was designed after lessons from the Spanish Civil War, and border clashes with Japan showed that existing Soviet tanks were vulnerable. The Soviets wanted a breakthrough tank, something that could smash through fortified lines, absorb punishment, and keep moving. What they created was a 45-ton beast with armor that was, for 1941, absolutely ridiculous. The frontal armor was 75mm thick. The turret front was 75mm. Even the sides were 75mm. This wasn't sloped, clever angles, like later tanks. This was just thick, flat steel. And in 1941, that was more than enough. The KV-1 mounted a 76.2mm gun, the same gun used on the T-34. This weapon could penetrate any German tank in service at the time from reasonable combat ranges. The KV-1 wasn't just tough, it could hit back hard. Now the KV-1 wasn't perfect. It was slow, topping out around 35 kilometers per hour on roads, slower cross-country. The transmission was temperamental. The crew ergonomics were awful. The commander had to double as the gunner in early models, which meant he was overworked and couldn't effectively command. Soviet radios were terrible when they existed at all. Lots of KV-1s had no radio, meaning coordination was done with flags. Flags in a tank battle. But none of that mattered when you couldn't kill it. The first encounters were brutal wake-up calls. There's a famous engagement near Rethink in Lithuania, late June 1941. A single KV-1, possibly a KV-2, the even crazier variant with a giant 152mm howitzer turret, held up an entire German division for over a day. This one tank positioned itself on a road, blocking the German advance. German tanks tried to engage, shells bounced off, they brought up anti-tank guns. The 37mm Pak-36, Germany's standard anti-tank gun, was nicknamed the door knocker by German troops because that's all it did against heavy armor. Knock. Shells pinged off the KV like someone throwing rocks at a steel door. German troops tried everything. They brought up the 50mm Pak-38, a better gun. Still couldn't reliably penetrate. They tried flanking. The KV's side armor was just as thick as the front. They waited for it to run out of ammunition or fuel. It didn't. It sat there, destroying German vehicles trying to pass, shrugging off return fire. Finally, the Germans brought up 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The famous 88, the gun that would later become the basis for German heavy tank armament. Even then, it took multiple hits. When German troops finally approached the knocked-out tank, they found the crew had fought until they literally ran out of everything. The Germans were so impressed they buried the crew with military honors. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the front, German units ran into KV-1s and had the same experience. Panic, confusion, shells bouncing off. Watching your rounds ricochet into the sky while this steel monster lumbered toward you. Let's talk numbers. Armor penetration in World War II is complicated, affected by range, angle, shell type, and a dozen other factors. But here are rough figures. The Panzer III's 50mm gun could penetrate about 50 to 60 millimeters of armor at 500 meters under ideal conditions. The KV-1 had 75 millimeters of frontal armor. You see the problem. Even at point-blank range, the Panzer III struggled. You needed a perfect 90-degree hit, and even then, penetration wasn't guaranteed. The Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm gun was even worse. It was designed to fire high explosive, not armor-piercing. Its anti-armor performance was pathetic against anything with real protection. You could shoot a KV-1 all day with a short-barrel Panzer IV and accomplish nothing except making noise. The standard German anti-tank guns weren't much better. The 37mm Pak-36 was useless. Completely useless. It could penetrate maybe 30 millimeters at close range. German gunners quickly learned to aim for tracks, trying to immobilize the KV-1 rather than destroy it. The 50mm Pak-38 was better, but still unreliable. You needed side or rear shots at close range, and even then you might not get through. The only reliable weapon the Germans had in 1941 was the 88mm flak gun. But these were heavy, designed to shoot down aircraft, not particularly mobile, and not always available where you needed them. Rushing an 88 to the front under fire while a KV-1 is shelling your position is not a fun experience. So, what did German troops do? They got creative and desperate. One tactic was swarming. Multiple tanks would engage a KV-1 from different angles, hoping to distract it, force it to split attention, maybe score a lucky hit on a weak spot. Hatches, vision ports, the gun mantlet, the rear engine deck. The problem was this required exposing yourself, and the KV-1's gun could one-shot any German tank. It was a very unfavorable trade. Engineers became crucial. Combat engineers would sneak up under cover, sometimes under fire, and place demolition charges directly on the tank. Attach explosives to the tracks, the engine deck, anywhere vulnerable. This worked, but it required getting close to a machine that really didn't want you to get close. Artillery was another option. Heavy howitzers could damage a KV-1 through sheer concussive force even if they didn't penetrate. A near miss from a 150mm shell could throw tracks, damage optics, or shake the crew senseless. But coordinating artillery fire on a moving target in the middle of a fluid battle is easier said than done. Some German units tried ignoring them. If you couldn't kill it, go around it. Let follow-up units deal with it. This worked in the chaos of blitzkrieg, where bypassing strong points was standard doctrine. But it meant leaving a dangerous enemy asset in your rear area, free to ambush supply columns or cut off your retreat. There are accounts of German tanks literally ramming KV-1s trying to damage tracks or jostle the crew. Imagine the balls that takes. You're in a Panzer III, you know your gun won't work, so you just floor it and crash into this 45-ton monster. It rarely worked, but desperation breeds crazy ideas. Here's something that made it worse. The KV-1 was actually pretty good in mud. Soviet tank designers knew Russian terrain. They knew about the Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that turned roads into soup. The KV-1 had wide tracks that distributed weight and gave decent ground pressure. It could navigate terrain that bogged down German vehicles. German tanks, especially early war models, struggled in mud. The Panzer III and IV had narrower tracks. When the autumn rains came in 1941, German mechanized units ground to a halt. Meanwhile, KV-1s kept moving. Not quickly, but they moved. This mobility advantage meant the KV-1 could dictate engagements. It could choose when to fight, where to fight. German units couldn't even rely on outmaneuvering it because they'd get stuck trying. Now, before we make the KV-1 sound invincible, let's talk about why Germany still won the early battles despite this steel roadblock. The KV-1 was a phenomenal tank, but Soviet deployment and doctrine were a mess. In 1941, the Red Army was in disarray. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had gutted the officer corps. Experienced commanders were dead or in gulags. The remaining officers were terrified of showing initiative because that could get you labeled a traitor. KV-1s were often deployed in small numbers, scattered across the front without coordination. They'd attack alone or in pairs, unsupported by infantry or other tanks. Soviet radios were terrible, so these tanks couldn't communicate with each other or with command. They'd roll into battle, cause havoc, then run out of fuel or ammunition because logistics were non-existent. Crew training was also inconsistent. Some KV-1 crews were experienced and competent. Others were rushed through training, barely knew how to operate the tank, and panicked under fire. The KV-1's mechanical complexity, especially the transmission, meant breakdowns were common. Soviet maintenance and recovery capabilities were poor, so a broken transmission could mean abandoning a perfectly good tank. German forces adapted quickly. They learned to bypass the KV-1s, let them run out of fuel, then destroy them at leisure. They learned to call in 88s or heavy artillery whenever a KV-1 appeared. They learned to target vision ports and tracks to blind and immobilize, but the psychological impact was enormous. German tankers went from feeling invincible to feeling vulnerable. They realized the Soviets had technology that matched or exceeded their own. That confidence they had rolling into Russia? Gone. The KV-1 forced Germany to rethink everything. First, they upgraded existing tanks. The Panzer IV got a long-barreled 75mm gun, transforming it from an infantry support vehicle into a legitimate tank killer. This gun could penetrate a KV-1 at reasonable combat ranges. The Panzer III got upgunned too, though it was clear the chassis was reaching its limits. Second, they accelerated heavy tank development. The Tiger I program, which had been a low priority, suddenly became urgent. Germany needed its own heavy breakthrough tank. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and thick armor, was a direct response to the KV-1 and T-34. Third, they improved anti-tank guns. The 75mm Pak-40 became standard, capable of dealing with heavy Soviet armor. Specialized anti-tank units received better equipment and training. Fourth, they developed new ammunition. Tungsten core armor-piercing rounds improved penetration. Shaped charge rounds, which used explosive force rather than kinetic energy, gave infantry portable weapons a fighting chance against heavy armor. Tactically, combined arms became even more critical. Tanks, infantry, engineers, artillery, all working together to isolate and destroy heavy tanks. The days of tank-on-tank duels decided by who had the bigger gun were ending. Now it was about coordination, intelligence, and combined firepower. The KV-1's dominance didn't last. By 1942, improved German guns and tactics had neutralized the armor advantage. By 1943, the Germans fielded Tigers and Panthers that outclassed it. The Soviets themselves moved away from the KV series, focusing on the T-34, which was almost as tough but faster and easier to produce. But the impact lingered. The KV-1 taught the Germans that they weren't technologically superior. It taught them that assuming the enemy was backward and poorly equipped was a fatal mistake. It forced a massive investment in heavier tanks and better anti-tank weapons, investments that strained German industry and diverted resources. For Soviet tankers, the KV-1 was a source of pride. In the desperate summer of 1941, when everything was collapsing, when the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, the KV-1 stood and fought. It bought time. It made the Germans bleed. It showed that the Red Army, despite its chaos and losses, had teeth. There are memorials in Russia to KV-1 crews who fought hopeless battles, holding off German advances long enough for other units to retreat or regroup, single tanks delaying entire divisions, crews fighting to the last shell, the last drop of fuel, the last breath. The KV-1 wasn't the best tank of World War II. It was too slow, too unreliable, too difficult to produce in the numbers needed. But in 1941, it was exactly what the Soviets needed, a steel wall that German shells bounced off, a psychological weapon that shattered German confidence. Early German tanks struggled against the KV-1 because they were designed for a different kind of war. A war of movement, of flanking maneuvers, of combined arms assaults against enemies with comparable or inferior technology. The KV-1 didn't play by those rules, it just stood there, absorbed everything thrown at it and hit back harder. It forced Germany to adapt, to spend resources, to rethink fundamental assumptions about armored warfare. And while the Germans did adapt, while they did develop counters, the time and resources spent on that adaptation were time and resources not spent elsewhere. In the grand narrative of World War II, the KV-1 is a footnote. But for the German tankers who faced it in the summer of 1941, for the Soviet crews who fought in it, it was everything. A monster, a savior, a steel beast that changed the game. The KV-1 showed up like a raid boss nobody ordered. And for a while, nobody knew how to beat it. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.